Hello and welcome to Law of the Sea and a Sea Show. Today, we'll be talking about the case concerning the land, island, and maritime frontier dispute between El Salvador and Honduras, Nicaragua intervening before the International Court of Justice. This case concerns a dispute in relation to the waters as well as several insular features in the Gulf of Fonseca, a small gulf on the Pacific coast of Central America to which the three states are riparian. Now, the origins of this dispute can be traced back to the disintegration of the Spanish Empire in Central America in the early 19th century. At that point, it was determined that the territories of the newly established states should correspond to the administrative divisions of that empire, in accordance with the principle of uti possidetis juris, as you have possessed under law, which would later be applied in the decolonization of Africa, Asia, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. While between 1821 and 1839, the sole riparian state to the Gulf of Fonseca had been the Federal Republic of Central America, following its dissolution, the Gulf became subject to overlapping claims by El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. In 1914, El Salvador and Nicaragua agreed to take their dispute to the now defunct Central American Court of Justice. In its 1917 judgment, the court reached the conclusion, based on an analysis of its administration under the Spanish Empire and subsequently under the Federal Republic of Central America, that the Gulf of Fonseca was an international legal condominium over which all three riparian states exercised common ownership. However, this judgment did not settle the question of maritime delimitation outside the Gulf of Fonseca, nor some of the land and island disputes in and around the Gulf. In order to resolve these disputes, a mediation process began between the parties in 1978, which would lead to the conclusion of the General Treaty of Peace of 1980 between El Salvador and Honduras. This treaty established a joint frontier commission to determine the territorial and maritime dispute. However, the commission was unable to reach a solution within the time frame of the mandate. As such, the parties decided to refer the dispute to a chamber of the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, by means of a special agreement in 1986. Now, let's turn to the merits of the case. The positions of the parties before the court were as follows. El Salvador asked the chamber of the court to uphold the conclusion of the Central American Court of Justice of 1917 that the Gulf of Fonseca was a condominium and that the only states that had sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction outside the Gulf were those directly facing the Pacific Oceans, in other words, itself in Nicaragua. Honduras, for its part, also ascribed to the condominium theory developed in 1917 by the Central American Court. Its position was that the perfect equality of rights enjoyed by the three riparian states in the Gulf of Fonseca implied an equal right to enjoy jurisdiction over maritime areas beyond the closing line of the Gulf. In other words, Honduras contended that its co-ownership of the Gulf of Fonseca allowed it to have a territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, and continental shelf in the Pacific Ocean, in spite of its concave coastline. However, Nicaragua decided to present a written statement to intervene in the case before the chamber of the ICJ. Nicaragua dispelled the equality of rights thesis developed by the Central American Court of Justice, arguing that no condominium regime had ever existed in the Gulf of Fonseca since 1839, and that as such, the waters inside the Gulf remained the internal waters of the three riparian states. Now, in its decision in 1992, the Chamber of the International Court of Justice decided to uphold the Central American Court of Justice findings in considering the Gulf of Fonseca a legal condominium under international law by virtue of having inherited it wholly in co-ownership. The Gulf had never been divided administratively by the three riparian states, neither by the Federal Republic of Central America nor the Spanish Empire. The Chamber of the Court thus concluded that the Gulf was a historic bay enclosed by a line drawn from Punta Ampala in El Salvador to Punta Consigüina in Nicaragua. The closing line was also considered a baseline from which a territorial sea proper could be measured. Given the fact that the Gulf of Fonseca was determined to be a condominium, Honduras was not locked out from rights in respect of the ocean waters outside the bay, including in respect to a territorial sea, an EEZ, and a continental shelf. although the Chamber of the Court was not asked to effect such delimitation. However, the Chamber of the Court did rule that this joint sovereignty did not apply to a belt extending 3 miles from the coast of the riparian states, which was under the exclusive sovereignty of each, nor to the rights of innocent passage through the 3-mile belt in the waters held in joint sovereignty. The Chamber of the Court also decided 4 votes to 1 that the island of El Tigre was part of Honduras, and also decided unanimously that the islands of Manguera and Manguerita were part of the sovereign territory of El Salvador. Lastly, although the Chamber of the Court received the written submissions of Nicaragua, it determined that it could not become a party to the proceedings, as its rights were not directly affected by the subject matter of the case. Now, let's turn to the importance of this case. The case concerning the Gulf of Fonseca between El Salvador and Honduras marked a curious precedent in the development of the law of territorial and maritime boundary delimitation and state succession. The Chamber of the Court upheld the 1917 findings by the Central American Court of Justice that the Gulf of Fonseca had a special international legal status. It is not only a historic bay, but also an example of an international legal condominium held in equal sovereignty by its 3 riparian states, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras. As such, the Chamber of the Court found that the principle of uti possidetis juris, according to which the borders of newly independent states must follow the administrative boundaries of the states before them, applicable in a maritime context. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and make sure to check out the next ones.